So, Adrian Piper has a lot to say. It's what I think about 4 pages long. So hopefully you were able to read all of it. I don't know what feelings it engendered in you, but there are a couple of things that I want to point out. Okay? So one thing, and I have it pulled up on my other screen here, so that's why I'm looking away. So one thing that Adrian Piper says is on page 184, quote, "In fact, some researchers estimate that almost all purportedly white Americans have between 5 and 20% Black ancestry." Okay? How will you feel about being certifiably white? Relieved? Proud? Etc.? Okay, so she really makes this very big emphasis on the distinctions that are drawn between white and Black. Okay, and the fact that she is saying that between 5 and 20% Black ancestry for almost everyone in the United States, okay, is significant because of the history in the United States, specifically something called the one-drop rule. And I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, but first of all, a little bit of history, and I'm going to try to keep this short because I know it's just me talking at you right now. So in 1882, there was a law that to be more than one race, this was called mulatto. For someone to be mulatto, they had to be at least 1/4 African. So they needed to have a grandparent who was African. Okay. So in 1865, Florida outlaws miscegenation, and you have to be at least 1/8 Black in order to be considered a person of color. So that's a great grandparent. No, sorry, great grandparent. Ooh, my math is off. Okay, so it starts more broadly and then it narrows and narrows and narrows. Okay, and then finally, you have what's called the one drop rule. And so this is the concept that if you have even one drop of African blood, you are effectively not a white person, you are a person of color. Okay, and this seems like something that is like 19th century, but it's not. It's actually adopted as law in Tennessee in 1910. Okay, in 1924, it's adopted by more states, including Virginia. So this is incredibly recent, less than 100 years. Okay, and this is why Adrian Piper is making such a big deal about 5 to 20% Black ancestry. All right, so just a little bit of history in terms of some court cases that are extremely important for you to know about. So you have a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, all right? And this happens in 1896. So basically, this is the idea of separate but equal, which is segregation. So after the Civil War, there was the Reconstruction era, and this is when people began to really start to kind of clamp down, become more and more racist, and try to put down African Americans in any way that they could. All right, so Plessy v. Ferguson. So what happens is this man named Homer Plessy, he is a Black man, but he passes as white, okay? And so he's approached by this group that is attempting to sue to strike down segregation, okay? And he's asked to board this train. And the train crosses state lines, and he goes into a carriage that is marked white only, okay? And he's hanging out in there, he's fine. And then he approaches the conductor and tells the conductor that he is not actually white, he is Black. Okay, and for this, he is arrested, and then the case goes to court because the group that approached Homer Plessy is using this to sue to break down this segregation, the Black-only car, the white-only car. So it goes to court, and it eventually goes up to the Supreme Court, where segregation is upheld, this idea of separate but equal, okay? So separate but equal abstractedly might sound okay, I mean, they're equal, but in practice, they are not equal. Okay, so think about access to resources and how important that is. Okay, so if you have sections of towns that are white only and black only, you're going to have vastly different access to resources. So if you restrict the type of jobs and the amount of pay that black people can get, and the type of houses that they can have, and then they all live together, and it's their well, not together, but like in the same area, right? Because of redlining. Um, it's their taxes that pay for their schools. And so because they make so much less money, right, they're going to have a lot fewer resources available to them. And I mentioned redlining, which was the practice of making certain neighborhoods white only and black only. And again, missed in history, I keep pressing that in front of you, but they're really good. They have a really good episode on redlining and just how disastrous it is, right? So if you are forcing people into neighborhoods with lower values, okay, um, you are perpetuating, you are continuing this lack of access to resources. Okay, so Plessy v. Ferguson was supposed to overturn segregation, and instead it upheld it. Um, and so this continues in place until it's essentially overturned by Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. And this is where parents of Black children sue for desegregation because the difference between the quality of Black versus white schools is so drastic. And it eventually passes, right? Goes to the Supreme Court and it passes. But this is not met with approval by many. Right, so think about, I think her name is Ruby Bridges. There is a Norman Rockwell. Let me share my screen really fast. Hang on, I'm so sorry. Okay, let's see here. So Luna. Okay. So Norman Rockwell did this very, sorry, my cat is just like clawing me to death. Did this very famous painting of Ruby Bridges, who was one of the first African-American children to go into a white school and essentially force desegregation. Okay, so what you see here is a little girl walking between four men, okay? And the reason for this, and if you'll notice, right, there are some splattered tomatoes. You can see here that there's a horrible slur graffitied on the wall behind her, okay? We're talking about a little, I think she's about 6 years old. She has to be escorted by the National Guard into a white school, and she's surrounded by parents and teachers who are screaming, who are throwing things. They do not want their children being taught in the same institution as Black children, okay? So the racism is virulent, it is violent, it is there. Okay, so we're looking at Jim Crow. Jim Crow is really very much 20th century, right? So all of these things. It's worth pointing out Emmett Till. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with him. So in August 1955, Emmett Till was murdered. Okay, he was 14 years old, and he was from, I believe, Chicago. And he was in the South. He was visiting extended family, and he and two of his cousins, about the same age, go into a store in the South in, I want to say Alabama. And there was a white woman there who claimed that Emmett Till whistled at her, wolf whistled, made her uncomfortable. And so that night, two white men, come to the house where Emmett Till is staying, and they drag him away, and they tortured him, and they lynched him, and they shot him, and they threw his body in a river where he was found a few days later. Now, the reason that Emmett Till is so famous is because his mother wanted to publicize just how virulent racism was at the time, right? So she actually helped kick off the civil rights movement because she had a funeral for Emmett Till. She had his body transported back to Chicago, and she had an open casket funeral, all right? There are pictures of Emmett Till online that you can find. I'm not going to show you because it is incredibly graphic and it is incredibly disturbing what was done to this child. And I don't feel right showing you that, but Emmett Till's mother wanted the world to see what had happened to her baby boy. And it became a national outrage. The men who committed the crime, which they showed up to the house where Emmett Till was, they dragged him out. Like, people heard him screaming in a barn where they tortured him. It was very well known who did this. And the men who did this, they were charged with the crime and then they were acquitted by a jury of their peers. Okay, so the woman who was at the center of this case, the woman who was wolf whistled at by Emmett Till, recently died, like within the last couple of years, and she admitted that she lied. She made the whole thing up. Okay, so this 14-year-old boy died because this woman lied about the fact that he found her attractive. It's possible that he did make some kind of noise. His mother said that he had a stutter, and so he would kind of whistle when he was nervous to help himself kind of concentrate and like decompress. So it's possible that there was some kind of a noise, but the woman knew that he was not coming onto her. He was not sexually harassing her. And these men were acquitted. So Emmett Till was a huge cultural touching point, really touched off the civil rights movement because people had been able to kind of ignore what had been going on in the South prior. But when faced with the horror of this boy's body, who's killed for looking at a white woman, they couldn't ignore it anymore, and it helped to ignite the civil rights movement. So all of these things are coming into play in Adrian Piper's piece. Okay, so can you see why she is so focused on the fact that we are not, people who think of themselves as white are probably not as white, as pure as we think we are, right? And how our country has a huge history of penalizing people for it. And something that I talk about in the other video for contemporary diaspora art is the fact that these women, enslaved women, were raped by their masters for A, sexual pleasure for the men, but also B, if you impregnate a woman who is enslaved and she gives birth, that child is automatically enslaved. So you've just grown the population of slaves. So something worth thinking about is Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson is known as one of the founders of the country of America, writer of the Declaration of Independence. He also is known for having a mistress named Sally Hemings. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, Sally Hemings was enslaved, and Thomas Jefferson was her owner. She became pregnant when she was 16, and Thomas Jefferson carried on this affair with Sally Hemings, and she gave birth to several of his children. I'm not sure how many off the top of my head, but as I mentioned, if a woman is enslaved, any children that she bears will be enslaved as well. Thomas Jefferson has his mistress, who is considered his property, and his own children by his mistress are also his own property. They were enslaved and they were not freed until Jefferson died. Okay. So it's worth pointing out that the reason that I use scare quotes around mistress is because Sally Hemings would have had no choice, right? You do not have the option of saying no when you are considered nothing more than a piece of property. And the person who is seen as owning you wants to have sex with you. You have no options. So this can in no way be a consensual relationship. And that's something that is really not considered. So anyway, the point is that there's this long history of white men using Black women for sexual pleasure, and then children, right? And so there's um, this history, this lineage of mixing, which is outlawed for marriage, right? For couples who come together consensually, but not in this instance. So this just to give you a little bit of background on Adrian Piper and where she's coming from in her piece.